Hello viewers, in the ongoing series on lipids, today we shall discuss fatty acids. And if we look at the syllabus of this chapter, that is lipids, we have to discuss today common fatty acids present in oils and fats, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, trans fats, hydrogenation, hydrolysis, acid value, saponification value, and iodine number. This is the syllabus for fatty acids which we have to cover. In one of my previous lectures, I have already introduced you to fats and oils. The link for the same you can see on your screens, and you can go through fats and oils in detail there. You know, fats, oils and waxes and complex lipids as phospholipids and glycolipids have one component which is common to them, and that is fatty acid. So let us today examine in detail the importance and classification of fatty acids. If you recapitulate, fatty acids are lipids themselves, and they are also components of triglycerides and phospholipids. Like carbohydrates, fatty acids are also made up of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. They are the key refined fuel of fat that the cell burns for energy. They are the basic structural unit of fats, and they may be saturated or unsaturated. So when we talk of a saturated fatty acid, we are referring to palmitic acid and myristic acid as examples. And when we talk of unsaturated acids, we are talking of oleic acid, linoleic acid and linolenic acid. Fatty acids are very important. Why so? Because they play a number of important roles in metabolism. They act as major metabolic fuel. They are used for storage and transport of energy. They are essential components of cell membranes. They act as gene regulators by controlling the activity of DNA. Dietary lipids provide polyunsaturated fatty acids that are precursors of powerful locally acting metabolites which are eicosanoids. As part of complex lipids, fatty acids are also important for thermal and electrical insulation. In polar bears and whales, you can see polar bears and whales, they are not wearing any clothes. And in Arctic region and Antarctic where we find polar bears, it is very cold. The temperature goes to -70. So there the polar bears are protected from cold by the complex lipids which contain fatty acids which act as thermal and electrical insulation for them. Fatty acids also provide mechanical protection. So what you have to remember now is that these basic units of fat are composed of chains of carbon atoms with an acid group at one end and hydrogen atoms attached all along the carbon chain. Next point that you have to keep in mind is that fatty acids and their salts are amphiphatic. That is, in them, the carboxylic part is polar and the long chain hydrocarbon is non-polar, and hence they help in the formation of micelles. And this property of formation of micelles helps them to function as detergents and soaps. So now let us see what is the structure of this very important molecule which is fatty acid. One of the end of the fatty acid is a methyl group. This is known as the methyl or the omega end. On the opposite end of the fatty acid is a carboxylic group. This end is known as the acid or alpha end. As you can see on your screens now, I have shown you a structure of a typical fatty acid, and what we find that on right hand side we have a carboxylic group, and this carboxylic group, this end is known as the acid or the alpha end, whereas directly opposite to it at the end is the methyl group. This methyl group, this end is known as the methyl end or the omega end. And when we look at the nomenclature, we will find that we can do numbering from the carboxylic end also, starting from the carboxylic end, and we can do numbering from the methyl end also. This we shall be discussing in detail shortly. Now, when we talk of fatty acids, now fatty acids are present mainly in an esterified form in fats and oils. So when we are talking of fats and oils, we are talking of triglycerides, that is an ester of a alcohol, that is a trial alcohol, glycerol, and fatty acids. And here what do we find? That when a fatty acid reacts with glycerol, it results in a ester linkage. So in fats and oils, these fatty acids are present as esters. Not only this, fatty acids can also occur in unesterified form as fatty acids in the plasma. So they can exist like this also. They can exist independently without taking part in an esterification reaction also. This is what you see. This is how they can exist in the plasma. Now, when we talk of fatty acids, so how do they occur in nature? Fatty acids that occur in nature, natural fats, are usually monocarboxylic acids containing an even number of carbon atoms. Why do we say even number of carbon atoms? Because we think that the building block for these monocarboxylic acids is acetic acid. So when we keep on adding the units of acetic acid, we will get an acid which will have even number of carbon atoms. Acetic acid, please remember, has 2 carbon atoms in it. Now let us see how can we classify these fatty acids. Fatty acids can be classified on the basis of nature of carbon chain, length of carbon chain, number of carbon atoms, and the nutritional requirement. So first let us see how can we classify them on the nature of the fatty acid chain. They can be divided into 2 groups. One is saturated fatty acid and the other is unsaturated fatty acid. What do we mean by a saturated fatty acid or an unsaturated fatty acid? This will depend on the nature of the hydrocarbon chain. When we talk of a saturated fatty acid, there we find that the chain is saturated, that there are only single bonds between the carbon atoms which are making the carbon chain, which is making the hydrocarbon chain. That is, they contain no double bonds. That is, they are not unsaturated. Whereas when we talk of an unsaturated fatty acid, what we find that its hydrocarbon part may contain 1 or more double bonds. Now, when we talk of saturated fatty acids, since they contain no double bonds, that means there is no point of unsaturation in them. The fatty acids are saturated with hydrogens, or we can say they are filled. Like here what you find is this is filled. That is, this is the carbon chain, hydrocarbon chain, and these are all hydrogens. We do not find any double bonds here. So this is a typical example of a saturated fatty acid where we have a carboxylic group on the right hand side, which is the carboxylic acid end. We have a methyl group on the left hand side, which is your methyl end. And the point that you have to keep in mind here is that it has no double bonds here. That is, all the valencies of carbon in the hydrocarbon chain are saturated by hydrogen. So this is a saturated acid, and the typical example of a saturated fatty acid is a palmitic acid. So when we talk of now saturated fatty acids, what we find that mostly they have a straight hydrocarbon chain with even number of carbon atoms. And the most common fatty acids contain 12 to 22 carbon atoms. And all of these saturated monocarboxylic fatty acids have the general formula R, or we can say CH3, CH2 in bracket N times COOH. What do we mean by saying CH2 in bracket N times? That is how many times this CH2 unit is being repeated. For example, if the value of N here is 2, that means this is being the methylene group is repeated twice, and the acid would be butanoic acid or butyric acid. If it is 3, then it will be repeated thrice. The methylene group will be repeated thrice, and we will have, say, 5 carbon atoms carboxylic acid, which is pentanoic acid. Now these carboxylic acids can be further classified according to the length of the chain. They can be classified into short chain saturated fatty acids. What are short chain saturated fatty acids? They have carbons 2 to 6 in them. So that means this acid will have either 2 carbons like ethanoic acid or acetic acid, and it can have up to maximum 6 carbons. So if we look into a carbon skeleton, the hydrocarbon, the acid structure, and there we find that it is having 2 carbons in it, we'll say it is a short chain saturated fatty acid. And if it's up to 6 carbons in a saturated chain, then we will address them as short chain saturated fatty acids. These fatty acids are liquids with bad smell. They are present in milk fat. As you know, butyric acid is present in rancid butter, and these are easily digestible. So as you can see on your screens now, I have shown you some short chain fatty acids. First one is acetic acid, which is containing 2 carbons in it. Then we have butyric acid, which has 4 carbons in it, and the next one is caproic acid, which has 6 carbons in it. Next are the medium chain fatty acids, and in medium chain fatty acids we have 8 to 10 carbon atoms like MCFA, and they are called as MCFA. M means medium, C means chain, Fa indicates it's a fatty acid. And for this I have taken an example of decanoic acid. Decanoic acid is also known as capric acid, and it has 10 carbon atoms in it. So when you talk of capric acid, the IUPAC name is decanoic acid. What does decanoic indicate here? Dec means 10 carbons, AN means it is a saturated chain, and oic is it has an carboxylic acid in it. So when we see that acid is having 10 carbons and there are only single bonds between the hydrocarbon chain, we will name it as decanoic acid. And the common name of this decanoic acid is capric acid. Now we know that this capric acid occurs naturally in coconut oil and palm kernels. It is found in milk of mammals like goat and cow. Next in series are long chain fatty acids. That is, long chain fatty acids have 12 to 22 carbon atoms, and they are named as LCFA, that is long chain fatty acids. These are solid at room temperature and they are most common in animal and plant fats, and they are less easily digestible. You've seen that normally now we recommend that the cooking should be done in oil. So when I'm talking of oil, we are talking of unsaturated fatty acids which can be digested easily. And when we talk of margarine, butter, ghee, there we are talking of saturated fatty acids, and these saturated fatty acids are difficult to digest. Now we go on to long chain fatty acids, and when we talk of long chain fatty acids, we find in them the number of carbon atoms in these fatty acids will be from 16 to 20, and the typical examples of these are palmitic acid, stearic acid and arachidonic acid. When I talk of arachidonic acid, I would like to make a point here. We have another acid which is arachidonic acid. So when you talk of an arachidonic acid, please remember that is a unsaturated acid. Whereas when we talk of arachidic acid, here what we find that this is a saturated acid. And arachidonic acid is formed by hydrogenation of arachidonic acid. So you have to please keep in mind, they seem to be very familiar but they are very different. One is saturated, the other is unsaturated. So please do not confuse between the two. Then we have very long chain fatty acids, and when we talk of very long chain fatty acids, they have 24 or more carbon atoms in them, and a very important example of this is lignoceric acid, which is also known as tetracosanoic acid. So when I say cosanoic, what do I mean by a cosa? That means it is having 20 carbons in it. Whenever we come across the term cos, you're going to remember 20 carbons. N is saturated and oic acid, of course, is a fatty acid. Now when we say tetra, cos, that means 20 plus 4. That means lignoceric acid, the IUPAC name of which is tetracosanoic acid, has 24 carbon atoms in it. And as I said, this lignoceric acid is very important. Why is it so? Because it is found in wood tar. It is also found in cerebrosides. Cerebroside is an example of glycosphingolipids, and it is also found in most natural fats. It is a byproduct of lignin production. So now when we talk of these saturated acids, if we look at it from biological point of view, or the acids which are present in animal fats, the most important saturated fatty acids are then palmitic acid and stearic acid, and they are widely distributed in animal fats. You have to remember that palmitic acid is the commonest fatty acid in human tissues. And now the examples of food containing high proportion of saturated fat will include animal fat products such as cream, cheese, butter, and other whole milk dairy products and fatty meats. And a person who is having high cholesterol or a more amount of LDA should avoid these foods because they will be harmful for the person. And certain vegetable products also have high saturated fat content, such as if we talk of coconut oil. Coconut oil, in spite of being an oil, it has high concentration of saturated fat, as well as palm oil has high content of saturated fat. So when we are talking of oils, we should look for oils which are having MUFA and PUFA, that is, which are having unsaturated fatty acids in them. The next thing that you have to remember is that nowadays we are believing in fast diet. That is, we eat food which are having high saturated fat content, such as pizzas. You want to have them every day. dairy desserts, and sausages. That means when I talk of sausages, we are not only talking of sausages, we are talking of all processed foods. They have high saturated fat content and one should avoid them. And fatty meats are also rich in saturated fatty acids, and they also contain dietary cholesterol, that is cholesterol which is very harmful. Now, as I've been repeating again and again, if we take increased intake of saturated fatty acids in our diet, it may lead to increase in plasma cholesterol and triglyceride levels and enhance the incidence of coronary heart disease. For example, if we talk of hypercholesterolemia, that is when the cholesterol enhancing saturated fatty acids, then please remember myristic acid, which is having 14 carbons in it and is present in nutmeg. Or when we talk of lauric acid, which is again a saturated acid which is having 12 carbon atoms in it and which is present in butter, coconut and palm oil, they lead to the high cholesterol in the blood. So when you're going to buy an oil or a fat, you should look what is the content of these acids in them. If the content of myristic acid or lauric acid is high, we should avoid such fats and oils because they will lead to the enhanced cholesterol in our body. Now, the second category of fatty acids that I would like to discuss with you today are branch chain free fatty acids. Till now, I have discussed with you fatty acids which are having a straight chain and which are saturated. So when we talk of branch chain fatty acids, they can have odd and even carbon branch chains and they occur in some plants and animals. For example, if we talk of sebum from sebaceous gland, it will have a branch chain fatty acid. Certain foods like dairy products like butter contain phytanic acid. This branched fatty acid is of plant origin and not synthesized in mammalian organisms. But what you have to remember is it is an oxidation product of phytol, the tail part of chlorophyll, and it is released in sebum through sebaceous glands. So when I am talking of chlorophyll, you know chlorophyll is made up of two parts. One is the porphyrin ring and then we have the tail part. In the tail part, this phytin is present in phytol, and even when we are taking vegetable oils or vegetable fats, it is metabolized in our body and we have phytin. So as you can see on your screens, phytin is 3,7,11,15 tetraethyl hexadecanoic acid, and this is a highly branched structure. That is, it has 4 methyl groups as subsequents here you can see. Now we go on to what is the drawback of phytanic acid. That is, if we are consuming food which is very rich in phytanic acid, then what do we find? That a person may get Refsum disease. Refsum disease happens when phytanic acid cannot be degraded. And when phytanic acid cannot be degraded, its deposits are found in nervous system, leading to neurological disorders of cerebellum, nerves and eyes. Now, how can we avoid this disease? As I've already said, we should avoid foods having phytanic acid in them. Next in category are cyclic fatty acids, and when we talk of cyclic fatty acids, one very important cyclic fatty acid is chol-mugric acid. Now in chol-mugric acid, as you can see on your screens, we have a tetradecanoic acid, that is, we have 13 carbons in the chain. And this cyclopentenyl ring is occurring at the 13th carbon when we number from the carboxylic group. and this has cyclopentenyl ring. So this is chol mugric acid, and the IUPAC name will be 13-cyclopent-2-enyl tridecanoic acid. Next in series, when we are talking of cyclic acids, is hydrocarpic acid. This again has ring structure, which is cyclopentenyl, and the chain has 11 carbon atoms in it. Therefore, it is named as cyclopent-2-enyl undecanoic acid. So now if I summarize what we've done today, so we can classify these acids, fatty acids, depending on the nature of the carbon chain. So they can be classified into two, saturated and unsaturated. Today in this lecture I have discussed saturated acids with you, and what we find in saturated acids, they will have a straight chain mostly, and the example for this is butanoic acid. And now what we find that it is not necessary that they'll always have even number of carbon atoms. They can also have odd number of carbon atoms. So when we have even number of carbon atoms, you know, acetic acid, butanoic acid, caproic acid, these are all examples of fatty acids having even number of carbon atoms. Whereas when we talk of fatty acids having odd number of carbon atoms, they will be propanoic acid, pentanoic and valeric acid and other acids, which are having odd, like 3, 5, 7 number of carbon atoms in them. Then we have cyclic fatty acids, and for this I have already discussed that we have chal mugric acid, and this is obtained from the seeds of chol mugra. Then we can have branch chain fatty acids, and I have discussed the example of phytanic acid with you, which is present in butter. Next we have substituted fatty acids, and these substituted fatty acids can have a hydroxyl group on them, and when we have hydroxyl group in them, the example for this is cerebronic acid, and this cerebronic acid is present in cerebroside cerebrone. So now what we find that all these acids can be classified on different basis, which I have discussed with you. For this lecture, I had taken up the references by Bruce Paula, Finar, Morrison and Boyd and Solomon. In my next lecture, I shall be discussing classification of unsaturated fatty acids with you. Thank you.